So I wanted to read this uh, article by Carlos Alberto Sanchez, found in the Cambridge History of Philosophy, 1945 to 2015, called Authenticity and the Right to Philosophy. On Latin American Philosophy, Great Debate, Carlos Alberto Sanchez. Introduction. The brutal subjugation of America's indigenous cultures required an equally brutal erasure of indigenous epistemologies and their corresponding cosmologies. Because the success of the colonial project depended on the spiritual conquest of native people, however, what was erased was immediately replaced with something else. This replacement, although similar in structure, was radically different in content, namely Western religion, Catholicism, and philosophy, scholasticism. The latter conceived as an advanced method of dialectical reasoning and rigorous conceptual analysis, representing civilized rationality. As a result, philosophy replaced indigenous oral metaphysical traditions with a written tradition that privileged disembodied rationality and linear thinking over other kinds of knowing that could be described as embodied, holistic, and nonlinear. An excellent and abridged analysis of the contrast, see Quijano, 2007. Philosophy is thus a modern intervention into Latin American history, a fact that makes it difficult and some would say anachronistic to speak of an Aztec or Nahuatl philosophy. The issue of whether or not pre-Hispanic thought is philosophy has been discussed most rigorously in Miguel León Portilla, Aztec Thought and Culture, a study of the ancient Nahuatl mind. James Maffei makes a strong case of an Aztec systematic philosophy. All right, just let me go back. Okay. This philosophy's role in the spiritual colonization and subjugation of indigenous people, moreover, makes it problematic to speak here of an authentic and autonomous Latin American philosophy. For these reasons, the history of Latin American philosophy has been written as the history of the appearance and progress of Western philosophy in Latin America. The historiographical record thus makes it seem as though Latin American culture has been passively witnessing the progression of philosophical history while remaining incapable of contributing anything new, original, or authentically Latin American to it. This historical record thereby makes it seem more as though Latin America has been unable to produce philosophers capable of making those contributions, which means that Latin America has been unable to produce its own philosophy, a Latin American philosophy. The fact, however, is that there have indeed been such philosophers, and they have made their own contributions, and thus that there has indeed been a Latin American philosophy. The question thus becomes whether these philosophers or this philosophy have been valuable, original, or authentic. If so, how so? If not, why not? In light of this history, it is unsurprising that a split has emerged between those who believe that the Latin American contribution to philosophy is original and authentic, and those who do not. Those who do not believe it often find the claim that philosophy's progression through Latin America has been unoriginal, inauthentic, or derivative as indicating that Latin American culture has not been capable of expressing itself in an autonomous and authentic way. Moreover, this alleged incapacity to express itself in this way signals an underlying Latin American underdevelopment, the proof of which they find in the actual social and economic conditions of Latin American countries. This underdevelopment prohibits the kind of authentic philosophical self-expression and understanding that validates fully rational, self-authenticating, and autonomous human beings who have become capable of such philosophical self-affirmation and self-creation. Those who believe the opposite suggest that such philosophical authenticity and originality have been there all along, since the beginning, in philosophical declaration that, although articulated with European concepts and within European intellectual horizons, have nonetheless spoken of a unique and historically determined human struggle to understand and communicate a revealed universal human truth. This split was embodied in what I'm calling here the Great Debate, was embodied in what I'm calling here the Great Debate between Augusto Salazar Bondy and Leopoldo Zea toward the end of the 1960s. This debate represents the defining moment in the history of Latin American philosophy as we understand it today. On one side of the debate, Bondi holds that an original and thus authentic Latin American philosophy is not possible due to Latin America's historical, political, and economic conditions of dependency. On the other side, Zea argues that an original and authentic Latin American philosophy is possible in spite of and even because of those challenging historical conditions. Since both positions cannot be right at the same time, this debate has naturally caused a rift among philosophers and philosophical historians. Even more importantly, however, it has provided a set of shared problems for philosophical engagement, in particular a problem of interpretation, as both sides of the issue aim either to interpret or to interpret away the possibility of an autonomous, original, and authentic Latin American philosophy. In what follows, we will thus consider the main lines of this formative debate, paying particular attention to the trope of authenticity that motivates it and that ultimately lends it its historical and philosophical significance. Affirming ourselves, Zea's historicist position, 1942. While questions regarding the authenticity of originality and ultimately possibility of Latin American philosophy have been posed since the mid-1800s, it is a Mexican philosopher, Leopoldo Zea, who first developed a profound philosophical response in lectures delivered in 1942 and then published in 1945 under the title En torno a una filosofía americana, toward a Latin American philosophy. Here, Zea asks whether there is such a thing as Latin American culture. If there is, then philosophy is possible. If there is not, then philosophy as cultural's highest expression is not. But why ask the question in the first place? In other words, why concern oneself with the existence or non-existence of one's culture halfway through the 20th century? Because Zea insists, before today, the Latin American had no need of a culture that would be considered properly his. Comfortably, he had lived in the shadow and from the shadow of European culture. Zea expresses a sense that the colonial yoke has been loosened enough after independence, 1800s, revolution, early 1900s, and the European crisis, manifested by the two world wars, to allow Latin Americans to ask themselves, as if for the first time, about the authenticity of their own cultural existence. For Zea, the crisis of Europe is especially relevant because it means that as European fractures and breaks down, it can no longer serve as the unproblematic purveyor of higher culture, direction, and influence for Latin Americans. As Zea writes, European culture has arrived at a crossroads in which it threatens to completely collapse. What must Latin Americans do? Collapse as well, fall into chaos in which that culture has fallen, in which it was a shadow? End quote. His answer is that Latin America will not collapse into chaos, but instead affirm its historical identity and cultural authenticity in the process of liberatory thinking. Liberatory in the negative and positive sense, because it will become thinking rooted in the Latin American circumstance and not in European culture, from which it will liberate itself. And because it will thereby liberate its own capacities to confront its own necessities, sometimes it had no need to do while something that it had no need to do while in the shadow of Europe. This kind of rooted liberatory thinking will be authentic thinking. Quote, this form of thinking can no longer be an imitation, but a personal, ownmost creation. End quote. So philosophy, to be doubly liberatory, must be authentic, and to be authentic, it must be grounded on its distinctive circumstances. The question then becomes whether Latin Americans are now in position, historically, existentially, socially, and so on, to make authentic philosophy. For Zea, following Jose Ortega y Gasset and Carl Meinman, philosophy is conceived in a historicist manner. Historicism, or the notion that philosophical truths are fundamentally historical, that they derive from and remain relative to history, thus gets appropriated as a point of departure for the articulation of authentic Latin American philosophy. Zea writes, quote, "The truth of each individual or generation is nothing more than the expression of a determinate conception of the world and of life. This makes it so that philosophical truths are attempted solutions to vital problems, are circumstantial, each one dependent on the individual that expresses them, and this individual expression depends in turn on a determinate society, a determinate historical epoch, or in one word, on a circumstance," end quote. Because historicism allows or even validates philosophical truths rooted in a specific life world or in the lives of particular people, authenticity for Zea will have to do with the manner in which that rootedness is articulated in the philosophical ideas. Ultimately, because philosophical truth is historical in this way, philosophy is not restricted to the rigid definitions of the Greeks, Germans, and the French. Historicism thus breaks philosophy free from its traditional conceptual enclosures, allowing it to become a vital response to one's own particular historical needs. Thus, Zea conceives of philosophy rather pragmatically as a natural discipline of thinking for the human being that resolves the problem that circumstances present. By natural here, Zea means the human ability to respond philosophically to certain existential needs. Philosophy is something that is made, and it is made when it is needed. Moreover, philosophy must not be the result of an ability to philosophize, but rather of a having the necessity to philosophize. Thus, philosophy emerges from a breakdown in the historical circumstance for which one finds oneself, existential breakdowns to which one must respond with philosophical solutions. Zea's historicist-inspired move to characterize philosophical authenticity in terms of its rootedness in concrete origins as a response to the problems that arise to which these existential circumstances give rise, is meant to affirm the right of Latin Americans to philosophy. Zea's historicist-inspired move to characterize philosophical authenticity in terms of its rootedness in concrete origins is meant to affirm the right of Latin Americans to philosophy, to their colonial inheritance. To conceive oneself as endowed with the ability, capacity, or right to speak philosophically from that place in which one stands is an existential challenge. Moreover, to the historical restrictions that deem philosophy a strictly Western practice, rooted in Greece and intimately wedded to the historical unfolding of the European cultural geist. Zea thus makes an empowering and liberatory move that also wills Latin American thought to become philosophy. Not everyone agrees with Zea's historicist reading of Latin American philosophy, however. Critics charge that his historicism is nothing more than a perspectivism in disguise, and one implicated in a short-sighted cultural relativism that thus betrays the principal task of philosophy, namely to find universal, transcendent truths free of historical and cultural residue. Such is the stand of the Peruvian philosopher Augusto Salazar Bondi, who finds in Zea's founding provocation a concealment rather than a revelation of the possibility of an authentic Latin American philosophy. It is Bondi's refusal of Zea's conception of philosophy and Zea's subsequent response that constitutes the foundational debate in contemporary Latin American philosophy. Bondi and the Philosophy of the Future, 1968. Zea's affirmative position regarding the nature of possibility of a Latin American philosophy assumes that philosophical ideas are tied to their place in their sense of being responses to crises which emerge from the circumstances or within it, and thus that philosophy can emerge anywhere at any time, and there is a human need for it. Anywhere there is a human need for it. Against this view, Augusto Salazar Bondi aims to problematize the ability to serve as a ground for authentic philosophizing. He does this, as Ofela notes, primarily by drawing a connection between the conditions for authenticity and the level of economic development. Shoot, in any particular place, for instance, in the Latin American world, because economic development or underdevelopment in Latin America is necessarily tied to its colonial history, Bondi looks there first and finds philosophy unavoidably implicated in the colonial aspirations of Europe. Philosophy in Latin America, Bondi concludes, responds primarily to the crisis and the needs of Europe and serves ultimately to maintain Latin America in a state of subjugation, dependence, and underdevelopment. He writes, brought to America and promoted in our countries are those doctrines that better harmonize with the goal of political and spiritual domination that originate in the peninsula. In this way, Latin Americans learn as first philosophy, that is, as a foundational manner of thinking that accords with universal theorizing, a system of ideas that responds to the motivations of man from overseas. End quote. According to Bondi, philosophy's history shows that it has been just another weapon in the arsenal of spiritual, intellectual, and material conquest and domination, one used against Latin Americans by Europeans. Philosophy was brought by the Spaniards because they came to conquer and dominate America, and they imported with them the intellectual weapons of domination. Bondi makes a valid and influential point. Even if we think of philosophy in the technical sense in terms of rigorous conceptual and logical analysis, these philosophical methods nonetheless be deployed in the service of juridical and biblical readings that serve to justify the indoctrination or subjugation of entire groups. See, for instance, the Valladolid debates between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Guinés de Sepúlveda. It's really good. A really good paper on this is the virtue of mestizaje by Pirondo. It's one of my favorite papers. I might just read that one. It's one of these things I'm uploading. Next. Okay. This perception. What's the footnote? 1 second. Held in Spanish by City of Valladolid, it fainted debate between Las Casas and Sepúlveda was meant to settle the question regarding the rights of the indigenous people of the Americas. It was the first international debate of its kind, arguing on behalf of the Spanish crown and on Aristotelian grounds. Sepúlveda proposed that because the indigenous population engaged in human sacrifice, cannibalism, and other crimes against nature, they were barbarians and natural slaves, and therefore their enslavement, exploitation, or destruction through war or other violent means was morally justified. De las Casas, arguing on behalf of the indigenous population with whom he had lived and to whom he had preached as Bishop of Chiapas, proposed that the Aristotelian notion, barbarian and natural slave, did not apply to the natives, were in fact capable of reason, and as such could be baptized and saved. History does not record a clear winner, although years later certain rights for which De las Casas had previously argued were accorded to the indigenous population. Yeah, well, maybe history doesn't declare a winner, but I think like De las Casas just mop the floor. Anyways, back to the reading. This perception of philosophy as a tool for conquest and domination will remain in the Latin American consciousness for centuries. So it is not surprising that a philosophy or philosopher claiming that an authentic Latin American philosophy is one that connects back to Latin American history and circumstance to its place will be looked at with suspicion. Moreover, even calling a particular kind of thinking philosophy will sound alarms, as this naming can call up philosophy's original aspirations in the New World. For Bondi, then, while philosophy has existed in Latin America, albeit as a weapon of domination, a genuine, authentic philosophy, one not intimately tied to the colonial project, has not. Indeed, a break with the colonial history is required for an authentic philosophy to take root. Bondi is thus forced to deny Zea's affirmation of Latin American philosophy on the grounds that underdevelopment, colonialism, imperialism, and the general lack of cultural and mental independence that these brought about has prohibited anything like originality, autonomy, and authenticity in this philosophical thought. Bondi does not seek to close off all possibility, however. An authentic Latin American philosophy is possible, but only in the future, and only after a dramatic shift in the social and political realities of Latin America. Bondi calls this dramatic shift by various names, including mutación de conjunto, or a collective change, and revolution. This change, shift, or revolution must allow the Latin American individual to jump over his actual condition and transcend reality toward a new form of life, toward previously unknown manifestations that will endure, toward what in the social political field are called revolutions. As an expression of the actual condition as a part of the present reality, philosophy as it has existed must likewise be transcended. That is, philosophy as part of the colonial inheritance, and thus as a tool of domination, is partly responsible for the situation of underdevelopment that prohibits original and free thinking, and as such must likewise be overcome. As Bondi puts it, the problem of our philosophy is inauthenticity. Inauthenticity digs itself into the historical conditions of underdevelopment and dominated countries. Overcoming philosophy is, in this way, intimately tied to the overcoming of underdevelopment and domination, in such a way that if an authentic philosophy is possible, it must be the result of a transcendental historical change. The suggestion here is that an authentic Latin American philosophy will not be possible until after the old order is overcome. That is, until philosophy has been known as it has appeared in Latin American history, is transcended in a collective and revolutionary gesture. Zea's rebuttal would take issue with this conclusion by questioning the manner in which an authentic philosophy is supposed to arise as a consequence of social and political change. For Zea, this kind of revolutionary change can only be made possible by a philosophy that is conscious of one's immediate circumstantial crisis. If philosophy is to come only after the fact, then what good is philosophy? Bondi anticipates this objection, writing, philosophy must not wait for a transcendental change. Philosophy should not be merely thinking that sanctions and crowns the events that have already occurred. It may gain its authenticity as part of the movement of overcoming our historical negativity, assuming that history, while striving to cancel its own roots. This remains problematic, however, as Bondi insists that an inauthentic philosophy has the power to create revolutionary change and in the process gain its authenticity. If inauthentic philosophy has this power, then why strive for authenticity in the first place? What will authenticity add to a philosophy that can already bring about transcendental change? Bondi's response to this challenge is to rethink philosophy as found in Latin America in terms of a consciousness of inauthenticity. That is, an inauthentic philosophy is already philosophical conscious, but one directed to the conditions of its own inauthenticity. In this sense, philosophy will be a conscience both of and for underdevelopment, or a specialized post-colonial critique that speaks only for those conditions. Moreover, as a consciousness of underdevelopment, that is, as inauthentic philosophy, its path to authenticity will be destructive. It will seek to destroy or overcome itself as it seeks to destroy or overcome the material conditions that maintain in its inauthenticity, as Bondi explains. Philosophy has a possibility of being authentic in the midst of the inauthenticity that surrounds and affects it by converting itself into a clear consciousness of our deprived condition, and into thinking capable of breaking chains and promoting the process of overcoming our condition. It must be, then, a reflection about our anthropological status, or, in any case, conscious of it, with a view towards its cancellation. A reflection applied to language or things thinking or conduct, but always anthropologically relevant as self-analysis. This means that a good portion of the task laid out for our philosophy is destructive, both for its being as well as its alienated thought. While Bondi's vision for Latin American philosophy to come as a destructive, critical, and ultimately political philosophy is in many ways an attractive reconceptualization, his real critique, that is, his answer to Zea, is that the philosophy that has not been philosophy at all, but something else. Latin Americans have not been capable in theory or practice or thinking for themselves, much less claim a right of ownership to a philosophy that they can call their own. Philosophy has existed in Latin America, but in the same sense that Europeans' Catholicism or positivism has existed in Latin America. That is, as already made realities unoriginal to Latin America. Zea's rebuttal in 1969. Their response to Bondi a year later in La Filosofía Americana como filosofía sin más. Latin American philosophy is simply philosophy. Overall, Zea acknowledges Bondi's critical insights into the state of Latin American situation, but he disagrees with Bondi's underlying claim, namely that authenticity in philosophy is possible only after underdevelopment is overcome. Philosophy, Zea insists, is born out of immediate circumstances, regardless of the state of their development. According to Zea, authentic philosophy will be found in any of the phases of human being, be that phase in which human beings aspire to their own fulfillment or one in which this fulfillment is possible. That is, authentic philosophizing about one's place in the universe or about one's moral ideals would not be closed off by the economic or material conditions in which one lives. While remaining conditioned by these circumstances, philosophy will always aspire to transcend them by aspiring to universal form as propositions, the truth of which cannot be reduced to, and so clearly transcend the contingent circumstances by which they arise. But the most glaring problem with the view, according to Zea, is Bondi's insistence that an authentic philosophy is possible only after underdevelopment is overcome. For Zea, this view is itself a manifestation of the colonial mentality that Bondi maintains Latin Americans is in their underdevelopment. The criteria for authenticity, Zea suggests, should be set not by the perpetrators of underdevelopment, but rather by the Latin American people themselves. In their harshest tones, Zea declares, quote, "Let us not once again repeat the old history and accept that we will only be fully human and we will only have authentic culture and philosophy only when we approximate once again Western man and his own development," end quote. Against Bondi, Zea proposes that an authentic philosophy is what propagates those relations of power that keep Latin Americans in various states of historical, social, and economic marginalization, including Bondi's implicitly Western criteria for a claim to philosophy. For Zea, inauthenticity in philosophy and culture is not a result of underdevelopment, but instead results from undervaluing one's own abilities and one's own solutions to immediate problems. A persistent undervaluation in which is itself a result of continuing to believe that one's abilities and one's solutions are inferior to the Western standard. As Zea concludes, quote, "To accept this supposition is precisely to be inauthentic, to continue to depend on the expressions of Western man," end quote. Authenticity then has to do with doing what one must do, with taking a stand on for one's circumstantial regardless of their material, spiritual, or economic condition. Ultimately, the problem with Bondi's view is that he limits the scope of his future philosophy to a liberatory thinking in only the negative sense, that is, to a consciousness of underdevelopment, while circumstantialist in its grounding is still restricted to a thinking about one's situation of dependence. This limitation conception has two roots. First, Bondi's association of authentic philosophy with the Western conception of philosophy as pure and transcendental, possessing a characteristic methodological tendency and theoretical proclivity capable of founding a tradition of thought. And second, an explicit denial of Latin American philosophical history. Again, there is a history of philosophy, but it is not a philosophical history of philosophy. The irony of the first of these roots is that Bondi appears victimized by the same imperialistic ideology that his diagnosis reveals as a cause for the absence of Latin American philosophical tradition. In other words, Bondi illegitimately measures the originality, authenticity, and autonomy of Latin American thinking against the standards set by Western historians and philosophers. Bondi does think that authenticity in philosophy will reflect one's ability to be responsive to one's own reality. Such philosophy is thus desirable, it is sought. But Bondi argues, due to underdevelopment and economic dependence, there is no such thing as one's own reality. Which means that authenticity, like philosophy, is impossible so long as these conditions persist. Unlike Bondi, however, Zea does not think Latin Americans must wait for revolutionary change in order to pursue the authenticity of their philosophy. Appropriations of the past rather than negation is the way to authentic Latin American philosophy. The problem with authenticity. In sum, then, Zea argues that an authentic Latin American philosophy is possible when philosophy is understood as a tool in the existential labor of everyday life in Latin America. Thus, there is, and there has been, a Latin American philosophy, one that makes possible a critical confrontation with current crisis. Bondi disagrees and suggests that there is not, and nor has there been, a Latin American philosophy, since the philosophies that have existed in Latin America have been inauthentic, imitative repetitions of Western conception, and will continue to be so as long as social and historical conditions marginalize and oppress the Latin American. For Bondi, an authentic Latin American philosophy is possible, but only after those conditions are overcome in revolutionary action. In short, for Zea, philosophy is for the now, for Bondi, philosophy is for the future. For these reasons, I maintain that this is the foundational debate in contemporary Latin American philosophy, and that we find those points of contention and those themes that define the tradition and will continue to define it for some times to come. An ideal central to both Zea's and Bondi's position, for example, is the idea. An idea central to both Zea and Bondi's position, for example, is the idea of authenticity. Authenticity is what marks out the properly philosophical form from some derivative manner of thinking. Both authenticity as the marks of distinction is not without its problems. Latin American philosophers might well see the very notion of authenticity as implicated in the same Eurocentric rationality that its affirmation is meant to overcome. A main proponent of this view is the Uruguayan philosopher Carlos Pereda. Pereda argues that authenticity, as a term, signifies cultural difference, is actually a term of exclusion, and it is prohibitive and totalizing. When a culture, and we could say a cultural expression such as philosophy, deems itself authentic, it has drawn boundaries around itself that exclude elements that may threaten its sense of itself as authentic. When a culture desires authenticity, it seeks that power to delineate itself, to close itself from future incursions and the disruptions of difference. Because cultural traditions are always the result of different contributions by diverse groups of people coming together in a common place, they lack any precise demarcations. Cultures are made up of exiles, migrants, immigrants, and the like. They are nomadic in their origin and never cease being nomadic, so that change and alteration is always a possibility. So unlike nations around which precise borders could be drawn by means of real walls and ideals, such as laws, cultures themselves lack borders, political or otherwise. While philosophers have attempted, especially in Latin America, to define and determine culture in various ways, such as by appeals to ways of life or a common history, what makes a culture unique is not something that can be captured by any one determined set of characteristics. Such determinations can only lead to intolerance and fear of foreign elements. Appealing to a genealogy of cultural formation, Pereda insists that the notion of a cultural identity itself is a means of protecting the perceived unity and uniqueness of a culture. As Pereda writes, so-called cultural identities can often be reduced to protective shields produced by interest and fantasies, invented narratives with little reality but necessary for some political end. Thus, who promotes such identities, such close totalities, rely less on some ontological or philosophical insight, which Pereda suggests are impossible to have, and more on rumors and stereotypes. We are dealing with a colonial attitude that confuses the heterogeneous reality of a culture with some fragile set of stereotypes that, in the best of case, designate the exception rather than the rule. Here it does is a fear of change and also desire for purity and stability that motivates the search for cultural and philosophical authenticity. Pereda situates philosophers such as both Zea and Bondi in common cult of authenticity, whose objective is always to return culture to some unadulterated state, a state of purity untouched by syncretism and mestizaje, or miscegenation. See also Thompson in his volume. The narrative of authenticity, to which both Zea and Bondi appeal without much critical resistance, is ultimately seeks to defend precise borders, ideals of homogeneity, and consensus fantasies of stability. This narrative, Pereda concludes, just like all forms of colonialism, must be dismantled. Tenemos que desmantelarlo. A critique such as Pereda seems to undermine the entire enterprise of Latin American philosophy if, as I have suggested here, the tradition is encapsulated by the great debate between Zea and Bondi. If authenticity is truly as bad as Pereda thinks, then there is no point in searching for it. I don't agree with Pereda on this issue, however. The search for authenticity is rooted in a desire not for the uniqueness of an exclusionary kind, but instead in a desire for recognition. A desire that, coupled with a hope for inclusion, allows Latin Americans the right to affirm themselves before and within Anglo-continental and other philosophical traditions. Why must we do this? Not sure. I'm sorry. What is overcome in becoming authentic, more importantly, is a colonial narrative that insists that is Latin American is not original or genuine, but merely an imitation, reproduction, and a repetition of an old world. Well, I need to read this again because I'm not sure if I reading this charitably. Instead, in a desire for recognition, a desire that, coupled with the hope for inclusion, allows Latin Americans the right to affirm themselves before and within the Anglo-continental and other philosophical traditions. Affirm themselves. I need to figure out what this really means. Because depending on like one reading, it's like it's not really on. As I see it, it's not really on the Latin American to affirm themselves in the light of the Anglo-continental people. But in another reading, I could see that it's a way to like stand up for yourself kind of thing. So actually I'll be curious to know what he means by this. I'll have to read more of this. Because what it says, I think I agree with. For other reasons besides what he's saying, but yeah, I'm unsure about this idea of authenticity myself. Anyways, let's do the conclusion. For both Bondi and Zea, authenticity represents a resolute affirmation of Latin America before the demand of an absolute sameness that historically called its colonies to conform to the terms of a European rationality and self-understanding. To make such an affirmation is to say, I am this and not that. This is philosophy and not something else. It is to say, I am difference before sameness. That is ultimately what it means to be authentic. This then is a liberatory affirmation. Mhm. It affirms a place in the universe of ideas and proclaims a right to think philosophy as a philosopher. In fact, according to Shute, and despite those shortcomings to which Zaya alludes, the power of Salazar Bondi's argument lies in provoking not to become self-complacent, not to sit still despite one's previous or current situation. Again, it could be objected that authenticity as a concept is part of a hegemonical ideological cluster that is Western philosophical history. So much as to demand authenticity is to continue to propagate a Western bias concerning what philosophy ought to be. But in reply, we could simply point out that authenticity is the name given to the achievement of self-worth that comes from sticking one's claim to that which is properly one's own in, as I say above, a resolute affirmation of oneself. It is to say, this belongs to us, and although you might have introduced me to it, I've made it mine through love and labor, and now different and unique and originally ours. Regardless whose side one takes, Bondi's or Zayas, their debate serves as a defining intervention that hastens the arrival of a critical consciousness in Latin America. A critical consciousness capable of addressing itself as philosophy and affirming itself as such by taking up one of the horns of the debate, by finding a path between them, or even by avoiding them altogether.